during my presentation for the grocery store. I got
So yesterday we basically just talked about flowers and what the parts within a flower are, what the structures do. So today we're going to talk a little bit about sort of how pollination happens and what happens after that. But just to go back to what we talked about yesterday. Cross-pollination is generally what's ideal for plants versus self-pollination. And we'll talk later on about how some plants can avoid self-pollination. But why is cross-pollination better for the species? Okay?
Since it's from two different parents, it can make a different offspring instead of being a clone.
Yeah, it adds variation to the species. It produces variation, differences. And we know from what we studied in evolution and natural selection that variation is important. Natural selection requires variation as the first part. There needs to be differences between the individuals. So if we just review that natural selection, we start off, individuals are all different from each other. And in nature, there's always this struggle for survival. Which individuals are able to survive?
Best of all.
The ones that are best equipped, best adapted, the fittest. The ones that have the best combination of characteristics. And the more variation you have, the more likely there are individuals that can survive that struggle for life. And if they can survive, it means they can then what? Reproduce. And pass on those helpful characteristics to the next generation, which over time leads to adaptation. So sexual reproduction is an important part of that because it produces variation. But if it's reproduction within one individual, which is what self-pollination is, it's not that helpful. It doesn't introduce new variations. So most plants have techniques or ways of encouraging cross-pollination versus self-pollination. And we'll talk about a few of those ways. One way that plants, because it would seem to make sense that, okay, if this is a flower, has the stamen and the anthers which produce pollen, the stigma is right here, you would think, well, self-pollination would be very, very common because the pollen's right here, the stigma's here, we're just fall and pollinated all the time. But there are some strategies that avoid that. One is an important one, the timing. Because as the flower opens and matures, the various parts within it also mature, but at different times. And so if the stamens all mature first, and the pollen develops and releases it, but the stigma develops and matures later on, that's going to avoid self-pollination. Because even if some of this pollen falls on this stigma, and it hasn't matured, it's not going to pollinate it. And so a timing of the maturity of those reproductive structures is one way that happens. Another way is through imperfect flowers. This is a perfect flower. Lots of flowers have perfect flowers, which means they have both the male and female reproductive structures within one flower. Some flowers, some plants, however, have imperfect flowers. You know, if there is a flower and it doesn't have, some of the flowers don't have pistils, it just has the male stamens, that's an imperfect flower. This would be a male flower. Other flowers might only have the pistil. Okay? Those would be female flowers. And so obviously, if each individual flower only has one or the other, it can't self-pollinate because there's no pistil here. So that's another method. Some plants, it depends on the type of plant. Some plants have all perfect flowers. So they have both reproductive structures and all flowers on one individual plant. Other plants have imperfect flowers. And on one plant, some of the flowers are male flowers, some of the flowers are female flowers. But there are also plants which each individual plant itself is all male flowers, or another plant somewhere else is all female flowers. So there's a lot of different sort of strategies that plants have evolved to try to encourage cross-pollination. Okay.
If it doesn't have the stigma, can it reproduce?
So if it doesn't have, if these don't have the stigma, okay, then this pistil can receive pollen from another flower somewhere else, and it can be pollinated, yes. Or if it doesn't have a pistil, this individual flower, okay, can't be pollinated, but the pollen from these stamens can reach other flowers somewhere else. So they can reproduce in those ways. The other means is through some biochemical means, where there are special properties of the pollen produced in a single flower which make it incompatible with the stigma of the same flower or the same plant, and therefore it won't pollinate even if it does land on that stigma. So the key is that most plants have means of encouraging cross-pollination because it's better for the species. It adds variation. So, in order for cross-pollination to work, pollen from the stamens needs to reach the pistil of other plants somewhere else. So how does it get there? How does pollen from one flower get to a whole nother plant that's somewhere else? What are some ways? Emma? Pollinators can do it. That's one way. Some plants don't rely on pollinators. Yeah, some rely on the wind to do it for them. So wind-pollinated flowers usually look different from animal-pollinated flowers. And it should make sense why. So wind-pollinated flowers, okay, first of all, often have very small petals. Because the purpose of most petals is to attract pollinators. Keep them in sort of one enclosed area. But if a plant's relying on the wind to take this pollen and disperse it, well, having small petals makes sense. So the wind can get at those anthers and take the pollen away. Okay. The anthers are sort of usually up high and exposed to the wind, so the wind can carry the pollen away. The pollen they produce is very, very light, so it can get caught in air currents and spread across an ecosystem. Also, the pollen is numerous. Wind-pollinated plants produce a lot of pollen. If you imagine, if you know what I'm talking about when I say in the spring when your driveway's all green or yellow with pollen, that's pollen from wind-pollinated plants. Okay? Insect-pollinated plants don't produce anywhere near that amount of pollen. But because wind-pollinated plants are just sort of relying on the random motion of the wind to take pollen from one plant to another, they need to produce a lot of pollen because the vast majority of it doesn't end up in another flower, it just ends up on the ground.
So would a dandelion be a wind pollinator?
No, dandelions can be insect pollinated. You know, and again, here you see cones. This is from some sort of pine tree probably. And all of this is pollen being released by those flowers. Just floating along in the wind, and hopefully some of it lands on female flowers. But many, many plants rely on animal pollinators. Okay? And animal pollinators include many different things. The most common are insects. Insects pollinate huge numbers of plants. Birds are pollinators. Even some mammals or reptiles or amphibians sometimes are pollinators of flowers. We're going to talk about why and how that works in a minute. So why do bees or birds or bats, why do they visit? They're not trying to pollinate the plants. That's not their goal. Why do they visit flowers, these animals? Grady?
Is it for like the nectar?
Yeah, they receive something from those flowers. Usually it's nectar. Nectar is a sugary solution that some flowers produce in order to attract pollinators. It's a good source of energy for lots of animals. Okay. And depending on which type of pollinator visits a flower, you know, insects don't need that much nectar. Right? They're cold-blooded, They're small. So flowers that are attracting insects often produce smaller amounts of nectar. Birds, though, for example, like this hummingbird, requires a lot of energy. So the flowers that attract birds as pollinators often contain much more nectar. Also, some animals actually eat the pollen itself, like some bees and beetles. It's nutritious, has protein in it. So the pollen itself is a source. And so that's what attracts these animals to the flowers in the first place. As they are feeding, what happens? Right?
Some of the pollen gets on them.
Yeah, some of the pollen, because as they're moving around through the flowers looking for that nectar, some of the pollen from the anthers gets on the animal. Here's a bat, which is completely covered in pollen. This is its tongue and its eye and its mouth. It's completely covered with yellow pollen from feeding in a flower. And so now when this bat goes and visits another flower, what's going to happen? Some of the pollen, even it just needs to be a single grain of pollen. That's all it takes for pollination. So as it goes and feeds in another flower, some of that pollen falls off and may land on the stigma and then pollinate the next flower. Okay? And so that's how these insect pollinators generally spread pollen from one flower to another. And so plants have lots of means of attracting pollinators. One way is in their coloration. Obviously, flowers have various colors, and often you can tell by the color of the flower what kind of animal it's trying to attract. Insects, like bees, they see blue colors pretty well, and yellow, and ultraviolet pigments. And so often the flowers that are trying to attract those species are yellowish in color or blue in color. Birds can see red well, and so often bird pollinated flowers might be red. Does anyone have a hummingbird feeder in your house? What color is it? It's red. They're always red. Again, that's to attract birds to that feeder. Bats don't see well at all. Often flowers that are attracting bats or nocturnal pollinators are white in color. Data?
So, what would like UV be? Like,
So we can't see ultraviolet light. It's just beyond what we can see, but animals can see it. And so often there are these ultraviolet or even colored nectar guides, which kind of bees and other insects can actually see. And they help attract insects to those plants and show them where the nectar is. Some flowers use a scent or an aroma, that's what this says, to attract pollinators, letting them know that there's nectar in the area. Now we think of flowers as smelling good. However, there are flowers that to us would smell horrible. They smell like rotting flesh. They smell like excrement, waste. Those types of flowers, what do you think they are trying to attract as pollinators? Carter?
bats.
Sometimes could be bats,
Amphibians.
maybe beetles, okay? Things that generally eat or congregate around flies, around sort of waste and so forth. Okay?
Like hummingbirds or something, who like red, or the bees who like yellow, do they see other colors in the middle time?
Yeah, sometimes they perceive some colors better than others. So, animal, here again is another animal pollinator, a bee, obviously. And you can see the pollen grains that are all stuck to this bee as it was feeding in a plant. Bees are probably the most common pollinator. They feed on nectar. They eat some of the pollen as well. And as they eat that nectar, as they're flying from flower to flower, they use some of that. But they store up and they take much more nectar than they actually need at the time, and they store it in their stomach. What do they do with it?
Like then they regurgitate.
Yeah, they bring it back to their
Yeah.
hive, the bee that collected the nectar. It's used some of the nectar for its energy flying back to the hive, but then as it's been in its stomach, it's partially digested it, it regurgitates it up. Then another bee will eat it. and further digest it, and then regurgitate it. And then another bee will eat it and regurgitate it. Each step along the way, the carbohydrates in the pollen are being broken down into simpler sugars. Eventually, after many bees regurgitate and digest the nectar, it's turned into honey. And they put it in these little honeycombs. They get around it, they beat their wings to evaporate some of the water, and once it reaches the proper consistency, they seal it up with wax, and that's honey. You can,
Wow. I would love to eat honey.
yeah.
now.
So, bees store this nectar, regurgitating it, digesting, and they store it as honey. What is the purpose of honey for the bees? Why do they go through all this trouble? Dean?
It's for when winter comes,
Yeah.
they can't go outside.
Yeah, so there's obviously no flowers blooming now. So bees can live off of that stored energy in the honey. Bees also can communicate with each other and tell each other sort of where a good source of nectar is. They do this using something called the waggle dance. The waggle dance.
Can you perform it for us?
Sure. When a bee finds a delicious source of nectar somewhere, a patch of flowers, and it returns back to its hive, it obviously would love to share that knowledge with its fellow bees. However, they cannot talk. It's not like the bee movie. Sorry. But what the bee does is the waggle dance. And what the bee, it goes back to its hive, and it does a little waggle dance like this. And then it loops around, comes back, does its waggle dance,
We need a video.
loops the other
Does it
way.
actually do?
Yes, it actually does this. And by the pace of its waggle,
Sorry.
tells how far the other bees need to fly. As they watch its waggle, they know how far to go. And the line it takes, the direction in relation to the hive, tells the bees what direction to follow in relation to the sun. So if it does its waggle dance this way, it's telling the bees which direction to go, and its waggles tell how far to go.
Can you see if they
That's
do
cool.
that?
We do this right
It's
now.
on the magic school bus.
Yeah, I'll show you the video maybe tomorrow. And so flowers also have these nectar guides which provide sort of a landing strip for bees to find this nectar. And we're going to get to fruits later on. If you have an apple tree, anyone have an apple tree in your yard?
I have one at my old house.
Okay. So what does an apple start as? Starts as a flower. And that apple flower, that apple blossom, will not form an apple unless what? Unless it's pollinated. After it's been pollinated, then the fruit forms. So if you own thousands of trees in an apple orchard somewhere, apple trees are insect pollinated. They're bee pollinated plants. And so you could rely on just bees in the vicinity to do the pollination. But what some people will do is they will pay a beekeeper to take their beehives, put them on a truck, bring them to your orchard, unload them at different spots within the orchard, and let the bees live there for a couple weeks. And the bees go out in the orchard, they feed on nectar from those apple flowers, and in the process pollinate them so you can have the maximum apple production. Say once the bees get back in the hive eventually, that person loads them up, the beekeeper, puts them back in the truck and maybe takes them to a different farm.
Why don't
And
we
so-
just like keep them
Do they pay the bees?
Yeah, they pay the beekeeper. That's like a way of the beekeeper getting income is by taking their bees to different places and allowing them to be pollinated. Do you know what a beehive looks like from a beekeeper? You've seen them. It looks like a little, like a dresser with drawers. And the drawers do slide out, and there's the honeycomb in there and allows the beekeeper to take care of the bees, take honey out. In those boxes, they can pick them up and load them and move them from place to place. If you're driving down the highway or the road, sometimes you see them off in fields. It looks like somebody left like their dressers out in the, sometimes they're different colors. Those are bees. They're people keeping bees. If you play any sports here, And you ever met Tim, the athletic trainer? He's a beekeeper. He keeps bees as well. All right. So here are some ultraviolet images of flower. And again, you see this is what it looks like to us. But to an insect, if we image it using ultraviolet camera, there are different patterns that we don't perceive, but insects can.
Okay.
All right.
Oh, I know that.
So butterflies and moths are also common pollinators. Okay, insects and butterflies and moths have a long proboscis, this sort of curled up structure that's poking into the flowers. That's what they use to feed off of the nectar in various flowers. And the shape and the length of it matches certain flowers that those insects tend to pollinate. Moth-pollinated flowers, because moths are active at night, are often white, and they have a very strong odor often, because that's what moths are attracted to. Flies and beetles, what do you think those flowers smell like? Not good. They smell like dung. They smell like rotten meat. And flies are attracted to those types of flowers, thinking that it's rotten flesh, because that's where they lay their eggs. And in the process, they pollinate those flowers. Birds. Birds have good color sense. So again, often the birds that have a good sense of color pollinate colorful flowers. They don't generally have a good sense of smell, so often there's not a strong scent from bird-pollinated flowers. Bird-pollinated flowers often have to produce a lot of nectar. Because birds are warm-blooded, they require more energy, and so they're going to require more from the flowers that they visit. Mammals do sometimes pollinate. Bats pollinate at night, so flowers are often white. Mice sometimes pollinate. They're also open at night. And again, they feed on these flowers, different parts, and in the process spread pollen. We're going to skip this slide. So, corn is a plant, obviously. Corn produces flowers that you probably haven't really understood before. If you ever have seen a corn plant growing in a field, the top part, when it's growing, the tassel, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Those are actually the male stamens of the plant. In a corn plant, each kernel is basically its own flower and its own seed eventually. And so the pollen's produced by this part of the plant. Now those individual corn flowers in the ear of corn are the female parts. And the silk of a ear of corn is actually the style of the pistil of each individual corn kernel. If you were able to strip off just the green leaves of an ear of corn, what you would see is attached to every single kernel is a long style. At the end is a stigma, and that caught the pollen. Okay, here's another picture of that. Here's an actual, so this is the kernel of corn. This is the pistil, this is the style. The end was the stigma that caught a pollen grain. The pollen grain grew all the way into the ear of corn, pollinated it, fertilized it, and then it grew into a seed. If you ever have shucked an ear of corn and you see that sometimes at the very top, there's like white parts that didn't turn yellow, those were not fertilized, those were not pollinated. Okay? And so they didn't develop into the actual corn fruit, which has the seed inside. Okay? So that's when you eat an ear of corn, that's what you're looking at. Now eventually, well, let's skip this for right now. We'll talk about fruits, I guess, more tomorrow. Some plants even mimic certain insects. Okay? And for example, here's a flower. Okay? This flower is actually kind of like trolling this insect and attracting it, thinks it's a female insect. It goes and attempts to mate with the flower, even though it's not an insect. And in the process of trying to mate with this flower, it gets pollen on it. And when it goes to another flower and attempts to mate with it, it then pollinates the flower rather than fertilizing a female insect. So, We'll talk about seeds and fruits
Oh, we got
tomorrow.
the bee video, the bee wiggle.
The waggle dance? Why? Didn't my demonstration make it so clear? I will show you the waggle dance tomorrow, a video of it.